Hi, folks. This is our first week lecture. Oh, good. Okay, so I'm going to try to use captions. It's auto-generated, might not be the best, but I'm hoping that will help with accessibility. All right. I'm trying to screen share. Hold on. You go here. There we go. Okay. All right. So this week we're asking the questions, what the heck are we talking about? Who are we referring to? What's urban? So here's the lay of the land. Um, so I'm doing two things at once. So the question of so this class is called the urban American Indian experience, and we're in American Indian studies. And so American Indian is the federal term for people who are indigenous to what is now called the U.S., and especially those who are members of tribes, which have a specific relationship with the settler state United States government, right? And so that is a very specific way to think about identity, and it's not one that's self-imposed, right? So that terminology often doesn't fit or feel great for folks. For some, that's working for them. For others, like Jonna Schmelding has a bit where she's like, American, I don't really want to be associated with that nation because I have my own nation and my own tribe. Um, for others, it's the term Indian that isn't fitting, right? Like Columbus was lost, and that's not right either. Um, but it is a term that you're going to come up against quite a bit, especially if you're working within legal spheres, right? And so this term is fraught, and identity is fraught and diverse, um, and just belonging can differ depending on who you're talking to and what you're talking about. So there's federal Indian recognition, which is what I was talking about, tribal relation with the US government. There's self-identification, which is then what the federal government asks us on censuses. And so sometimes that's not entirely accurate either. And then there's the real crux of the issue, which is relationship to living and also ancestrally rooted indigenous community. And so that's what this is a picture of Dr. Kim Tallbear, and I'm sorry, a very poorly, um, not a very good resolution image of her kind of landmark text, Native American DNA. And so, she's responding to the boom of self-ancestry DNA test kits that now exist, and also points to kind of their flaws and their shortcomings. And then also, a repercussion of that is that some people have been told by these kits that they bought and then submitted their biological information to, and then were analyzed based on proprietary data sets that are owned by that company or that they bought access with, right? So we're like going through lots of filters here, that they may have some indigenous ancestry, right? And like, does that really fly? Can you really like show up to a community and say, well, um, my ancestry told me this? And at the same time, there's a very real phenomenon of uh, boarding school, um, uh, the literal theft of children from Indigenous communities and families. In Canada, they call it the 60s scoop, but it happened way before the 60s, where children were taken out of their communities and their homes really lost connection there. So there is both room for rediscovery and for rekindling those lost relations, and also there's a lot of not entirely true information, and people who might be making claims that aren't based on their experiences. So it's a pretty contentious space to be in, but it's really important. And so we have a lot of different terms here that we're going to be grappling with too. When I speak about experiences, I use kind of a mix. I talk about being indigenous, and I talk about indigeneity, which literally means just to be from a place, and I expand that to mean tied to that land as kin. A synonym would also be original inhabitants. So indigenous can be applied globally, right? You have Aboriginal Australian people who are indigenous to the land mass of Australia, which has a very different name depending on if you're talking to a Wiradjuri person, right, or someone else. Um, Native also means to originate from a place. It can be synonymous with indigenous, but then you have people who come way later, right? And you might be talking to somebody who is trying to say that they were born in Chicago, even though maybe their ancestry is like Polish, and they might say, "Oh, I'm a Chicago native." Um, so not speaking on the same terms there. Um, Aboriginal is a term that also comes up to talk about the first people of a place. That really is popularized in Australia, but also Canada. Then there's the term Indian. Like I said, it's the federally recognized term within the US, and up until recently, Canada. I spell it NDN, which is a more contemporary term that folks have used to kind of reclaim agency and again talk about how that was an imposed term that now is being reclaimed. And then within the US, there's also very distinct relationships and experiences for Alaska Native peoples and Native Hawaiian peoples. And so then I also have a smaller list of other identities that exist within the Americas. So within Canada, you have First Nations, Métis, and Inuit as very distinct categories of identity that can overlap, but within the legal spheres of Canada, that's what people will talk about. And then Indigenismo, which is a political ideology in Latin America. But all of those intersect with indigenous identities to the Americas. I think we also kind of have to lay the land for thinking about sovereignty, which similarly to when you try to define who is what, gets very tricky. So again, in a legal realm, sovereignty is the authority of tribes to govern themselves, and it also functions as a protected political status conferred to tribes during the treaty era. Um, this phenomenon has since been extended to lots of different elements of life. To talk about cultural sovereignty, to talk about sexual sovereignty, is to talk about agency and authority over certain aspects of those lives, of lived experience, right? And so right now there are 574 federally recognized tribes within the United States, but there are hundreds more um, uh, groups of indigenous people who do not have federally recognized status for one reason or another. Um, so that's a complicating factor, right? Uh, Sovereignty should include the right to establish your own form of government, determine membership requirements, and enact legislation and establish law enforcement and court systems. Of course, the settler colonial government tramps all over that very often. And the thing that kind of intersects with what we're talking about this week is determining membership requirements, right? So who belongs to a tribe is often up to that tribe, but is influenced by settler colonial history, right? And so when we talk about who's a member of a tribe, we often talk about who's enrolled. And that could be determined by descent. Um, so just lineage, establishing direct descent. And then different tribes. So like, for example, the Blackfeet tribe. does enrollment based on the father's side. You could have a matrilineal system, or you could have a patrilineal system. And then there's also a blood quantum. And so you can't be less than a fourth, and then you would lose your enrollment. Blood quantum, if you want to talk more about that, I highly recommend looking at Dr. Tallbeer's work, who I just talked about on the last page. Again, a kind of imposed system, but a way to enact sovereignty. So it's very complex. Another approach is to go off roles. So like during the Dawes Act, when the federal government was creating reservations and giving land to different people, they had to create roles in order to dole that land out. Also imperfect. And in particular for Afro-Indigenous relatives, they often were excluded from those roles or erased from those roles, right? And then there are some pretty key court cases. My brain is just got off my other job and I'm here doing this job. There's some pretty key legal resolutions, court cases that have kind of set the tone for sovereignty and will be referred to a lot. So here's a little cheat sheet for them. Weirdly enough, they're coming from Georgia. They're what led up to the Trail of Tears. So there's John v. McIntosh, 1823. This kind of illegally concretizes the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny. Like that's now the law of the land. But at the same time does acknowledge natives' right of occupancy, which means that if you're on that land, you have a right to occupy that land, but it excludes ownership or title. So we're already kind of setting up a situation for land loss here. Then the Cherokee Nation lobbied against the state of Georgia, and the term domestic dependent nation was coined, which established an obligation, often kind of called ward-like or a parental child kind of situation by some scholars, between the federal government and tribal nations. And again, very sticky. So Native people are no longer U.S. citizens, but they are in this federal trust relationship. So they're not citizens of the U.S., they're citizens of the Cherokee Nation, which enforces the Cherokee Nation's sovereignty. But at the same time, the U.S. has certain obligations to tribal peoples. Then there was Worcester versus Georgia, which actually strengthened tribal sovereignty and that federal trust relationship. That did not endure. So, um, leading up to that sequence of laws, there was the treaty and removal period, which is settlers coming in, and the tactics to deal with Native peoples was to get them out of the way, remove, and when there was any kind of tension, engage in treaty making, which, as you all should know, was not always upheld. It was frequently not upheld. And the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which created Indian Territory in Oklahoma, is really kind of the pinnacle of that period. I know I focused a lot on the Southeast, on Cherokee Nation, but the Dene Long Walk, also a very key part of this period of relation. Then following those court cases, and then also following some really brutal and violent removals, like the Long Walk and the Trail of Tears, became the allotment and assimilation period. So this is the Dawes rules that I was talking about previously, 1897. The Dawes Act institutionalizes this and creates blood quantum to disperse plots of land. Basically, the whiter you were, the more you could be eligible for land. And then 1879, following that, tactics are shifting from let's just move people away to now we are trying to claim all territory. So we want to try to assimilate Native people into this settler society. And so boarding schools open, the Carlisle Indian School being the first of many. And that was a phenomenon in the US and in Canada. Then the next kind of period is from the 40s to the 60s, the termination of that federal relationship with tribes and relocation. And this is kind of an extension of assimilation to the point of we're not even going to acknowledge tribal sovereignty anymore. We're going to kind of step back from that relationship. So in 1948, the Bureau of Indian Affairs has this relocation program, which is really encouraging Native peoples to and incentivizing them to leave their reservation communities and move to the cities. We'll look at some historical documents about that. Then there's House Resolution 108, which ended federal relationships with many tribes, terminating their tribal status. The most famous would be the Menominee. They have since regained their federal recognition, but over 100 were terminated. And when you lose that federal recognition, then you also lose your reserve, you lose your land, right? And so then only a small percentage has since regained that recognition. So those are just that's what we're talking about here. And that's all at play in terms of thinking about identity. We're gonna, hopefully this works. Okay, great. There's just some very short videos that I found online that sum up these components.
After World War II, federal Indian law policies shifted back to assimilation and even to policies of terminating Indian tribes. In 1950, Dylan S. Meyer, former director of the detention camp program for Japanese Americans during the war, became Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Under the oversight of Mr. Meyer, new federal policy took a three-pronged approach: termination of Indian tribes, relocation of Indian people, and transferring federal jurisdiction to state governments through Public Law 280.
House Concurrent Resolution 108 was passed in the early 50s by the Congress. This means both the House and the Senate. And the intent and the spirit of the resolution was to terminate tribes as rapidly as possible. That is, get the government out of the Indian business. To have the federal government withdraw its supervision was very, very harsh. And to summarize, we were no longer a federally recognized tribe. Our land became subject to taxation. Our people had no federal services such as health services, education, and any of the other programs and services that were provided to tribes at that point. It was a cultural, economic, and political disaster.
Overall, 109 tribes were terminated under this policy.
Okay.
Another policy during the 1950s was a federal program to relocate Indian people.
The whole purpose of relocation was to get us off the reservations. The Bureau of Indian Affairs paid one-way tickets to, well, someplace the farthest from the reservation you could be.
As a result of the relocation program, we have thousands of Indians who now live in major cities across the country: Minneapolis, Chicago, Dallas, Cleveland, Los Angeles, New York City.
Congressional act from this decade remains a particularly complicated piece of legislation for tribes in several states. It affects jurisdiction, which is the authority to enforce law.
Public Law 280 is a law passed by the federal government in the early 1950s during the termination era, and has, unfortunately, some of the flavor of the termination era. It was passed due to a perceived lawlessness in Indian country. And for better or worse, it really hasn't fixed that lawlessness. What it has done is brought state police, and investigators and prosecutors into Indian country. In any event, it extended state criminal jurisdiction over first 5 states and then later 6. Plus, several states adopted sort of a partial PL 280 jurisdiction over certain things like maybe highways. Um, it also extended, besides the criminal jurisdiction, jurisdiction to state courts over civil causes of action, basic tort disputes or basic contract disputes. The criminal side was exercised frequently over the past 50 years of PL 280's history. The civil side is really just now coming to the fore because when Congress delegated this power to states, then generally the tribes that were in PL 280 states found themselves without funding for tribal courts.
Public Law 280 did not take criminal or civil jurisdiction away from the tribes. In the states where this law applies, both tribes and states share jurisdiction over criminal and civil matters. This often creates confusion over jurisdiction and a race to the courthouse and to judgment. In the states where Public Law 280 applies, tribes and states need to agree on a systematic process for resolving jurisdictional disputes.
All right. Okay. So, just got some information there, additional information about those kind of landmark legislations. The next thing that came with relocation too was just this assumption that moving natives into the city, it was again just an extension of this fantasy of complete assimilation, right? And that meant permanent detribalization and urbanization, however you want to think about that. So here are some archival, I hope this isn't covering that, I'll move it. Here's some archival images of advertisements and flyers put up in Indian communities to try to convince people to relocate. Denver was a really big hub, lots of cities in California, especially Los Angeles, Chicago. Those were kind of the biggest ones, but urban areas all over had this BIA program, and so you can see there was a lot of this was aimed at younger kind of home starting people, right? They wanted because they wanted to promote this kind of American bootstrap mythology of the two parents, two kids, white picket fence, home owning middle class, right? So we're promoting good jobs, happy homes, many churches, right? We're expecting a particular kind of family to come in, providing some training, and then oh, it's beautiful, and you'll have all these opportunities. And so that was a big part of BIA propaganda, trying to move people into the cities. And, for some people, it was successful. For many, the promises of the BIA fell short, but it did create very important, thriving urban Native communities that were often multi-tribal. And so this is where our concepts intersect of, who are we talking about when we're talking about American Indian or Native, and then who and where are we talking about when we're talking about urban? So Susan Lobo, who opened this class, just made this class first, in her book on the subject says, urban is a place, a setting where many Indian people at some time in their lives visit, establish an encampment, or settle into. Urban doesn't determine self-identity, yet the urban area and urban experiences are contexts that contribute to defining identity. I actually have to talk back to Susan about this. Urban is a concept, and it's a human-made ideal that isn't uniform, right? And many Native people, so urban cities sit on ancestral territory, right? So I don't think that this is just a place where sometimes Native people move to. I think this can also be home territory for many people. So there's like a whole other half to that that is maybe not included in that quote. This is also extremely relevant right now because according to the Urban Indian Health Institute, and most recent census records, 7 out of 10 American Indians and Alaska Natives live in urban settings right now. And so approximately 71% of American Indians and Alaska Natives. So that could be equivalent, but even when you get more into the percentage, it's actually a little bit higher. Um, uh, so it's really important if we're talking about Indigenous experiences to be thinking about the urban setting. But then, um, uh, for me, I'm always curious then, what's the relationship with land look like? Um, and so two scholars that I think are asking very critical questions from very different disciplines. Keith Basso is an anthropologist, and Leanne Simpson is Anishinaabe community member and knowledge keeper. So they have different accesses. They're working with different communities, have different access to communities, and also are located geographically different. But they both make very compelling arguments about how land um, is in collaboration with the way that people think about their world, conceive of their world, and can structure thought patterns and also structures relationships. So Keith says knowledge of place is therefore closely linked to knowledge of the self, to grasping one's position in the larger scheme of things, including one's own community, and securing a confident sense of who one is as a person. And Leanne Simpson says something similar, but specific to her Anishinaabe community. Um, and so, these layers of identity all are overlapping, just as territory and infrastructure is, right? So again, I think in that little poll quote that I had from Dr. Lobo, one could easily walk away thinking that the urban space isn't native space ancestrally or even in a contemporary sense, and that's just not at all true, right? So I pulled just a couple of maps. One that's very easy to point to is Lenni Lenape territory that contemporary Manhattan sits on, as well as several very urban spaces down into New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And even Maryland, all on Lenape land. And then also, here in Arizona, right? Um, Tucson is at the intersection of Tohono land and then Pascayaki, um, maybe sitting a little bit more on in terms of the very urban space, the very built space, maybe a little bit closer to Yaqui, but people weren't drawing these very rigid maps. So uh, could be different historically. Phoenix sitting on Gila River, Salt River, very close. And then Flagstaff, uh, right in the middle of several different Native nations. And you can just look up, I think I have two resources here. The Decolonial Atlas project has kind of like printable maps, and then Native Land, which is an app out of Canada, has an interactive map. So you could put in any place in the world that works kind of like Google Maps, and then it will show you ancestral territory and overlapping presence and claims. And so, because my background is in the visual arts, I wanted to show some examples of how Native artists are expressing these, tricky, sticky confluence of topics. And so I think two artists who are very well known for speaking very poignantly on identity are Ilia Titsunajane and James Luna. And James Luna is kind of playing with stereotypes and expectations, and Titsunajane is thinking about also federal recognition and roles. And so, has the kind of like barcodes and the enrollment numbers and things printed on her face. Another contemporary artist who came a little bit after is very inspired by both artists, but especially James Luna, is Erica Lord, who herself is mixed ancestry. And, in this series, she's kind of playing with your very traditional headshot, which could be used for jobs, but is also very much a part of federal recognition, which you do when you get your passport, when you get your driver's license, right? And then masking and voguing in lots of different potential facets of her mixed identity. She also has very explicit art conversations about enrollment in this piece, and then Blood Quantum as the kind of sister piece. And so by fragmenting the photos that make up her continuous arm, she's kind of talking about the fragmentation that this way of looking at belonging can do. Um, and then she has this series about, expectations of pigmentation of skin and melanin, and um, pretty provocative imagery and text, right? I tan to look more native, challenging, but also like reflecting on her own experience, I think, of being mixed. So some strong voices there in terms of visual artists, who I think their work intersects with these like kind of picked out 4 elements of urban Indian communities that I think are worth naming explicitly. So these communities are multi-tribal and class diverse because people are coming from all over. Again, they could be on their ancestral homeland, or they could have traveled because of relatives or because of relocation. And they have very different experiences in life, in terms of socioeconomic class and tribal and geographic backgrounds. And then there can be, one center or one community that kind of holds all of them, right? Because of this, they're often also multi-generational. And so if people moved there during the height of the relocation program, now they're elders or they may have even passed. And so there's young folks and older folks. Many of these communities are organizationally linked. So they might have their friendship center or their Indian center, or powwows or art events that are really kind of tying and concretizing this intertribal group. And then there is also a distinct history within the urban territory. This is a picture of Alcatraz, and we'll talk a little bit about the occupation of Alcatraz in this class, as a political action coming out of the AIM movement, the American Indian movement. And so not only are folks carrying the histories of their people in their territories, they're also now engaged in a part of specific urban community history. So Dr. Susan Lobo, when she was teaching this class and on faculty here, most of her findings came out of her extensive years of research and working with the Bay Area urban Indian community. And here are the kind of prompts and components that she found in her research that bound people together in that space. So ancestry was one, meaning does a person have Indian relatives and ancestors and function as a member of an Indian extended family? Appearance. So coming back to what Erica Lord just talked about, does a person look Indian? That could play a role in this. Cultural knowledge. Is the person knowledgeable of their culture, of their people, and of those pan-Indian values and social expectations shared within the urban Indian community? So I think that's pretty important because you have your distinct tribal history and knowledge, and then there's also kind of a pan-Indian experience. So that kind of melting pot that you would need to align with as well in order to be a part of this community, as Lobo was finding in the Bay Area. I'm not saying that's the case overall, but I do think that's at play in many urban experiences. And then community participation. Does the person come out for Indian events and activities in the community and contribute to the community well-being? I think that's a critical part of identifying as part of a community, no matter what that community is. But I think it's particularly critical when your community is small and also multi-tribal, right? You want to be able to see people and still know people. Um, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is how cities predate colonization, and how urban centers or cosmopolitan centers are not something that they are something that imposed themselves upon Indian territory, but they are also something that was created from Indian territory. So I'm going to stop this lecture here so that we can just chunk it up nice. And the next one's going to talk about histories of indigenous gathering places that hosted many people, and might not look urban in a contemporary sense, but are cosmopolitan and are gathering places historically. All right.